Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Faster Masters Rowing Radio, where having a rowing coach only makes you faster. Following a program gives you a true pathway to becoming a confident rower who's respected by your peers. You can become the athlete you want to row with. I'm Rebecca Caroe, and as ever, I'm joined by my colleague, Marlene Royle.
Hello, Rebecca, and hello to our Faster Masters. It's nice to be here.
In this Olympic rowing week, I have been glued to the screen watching.
Yeah, me too. And, everything kind of runs on Eastern time, US. Everything is, running a little bit late into the evening and night. So I think we've all been staying up.
Not so good for early morning practice then.
Temporary. It's temporary. One more day. Today's the last day of racing. So
I have been doing day by day finals day summaries afterwards on my other podcast, Rowing Chat.
Oh, okay.
And so day one finals, I got the Australian Olympian Sarah Cook on, and yesterday I had Mahi Drysdale from New Zealand on, and today I am doing the wrap up with Drew Ginn.
Cool. That's very cool.
It has been really good fun, and it's, as someone said to me in a private message, wow, you're shooting the breeze with Mahi Drysdale. It is fun.
Yeah. Well, and they've got such an insider view of what's been going on too. It's been a really pretty dramatic Olympics. I think the racing is always good, but I think the racing has been extremely close, extremely competitive, so many factors with the weather and the chop and the starts, all the things we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. And you wouldn't want anything else. You need the Olympic regatta to be the pinnacle of our sport.
Yes.
And for me, and all of these new sports coming into the Olympics, I kind of feel that the Olympics needs to be the pinnacle for your sport. And, for sports like golf, that's quite a challenge because it is not, tennis,
right.
It really is not, or not yet. It could become it, But having said that, I am loving the new sports. Absolutely love the skateboarding and the surfing. A lot of people didn't like it, but I just found that fantastic. There's activity, competition, there are so many different technical styles of what people do. I have thought that actually that's really quite enlightened on the path of the IOC.
I watched a bit of the surfing, and I've watched quite a bit of the equestrian events too. I like the equestrian events, particularly the dressage. So I've watched a fair bit of that. Track and field will be starting. So I tend to watch a lot of track and field, but that's just getting started, I think, tomorrow.
Yeah. One of the things that I've found, let's call this the This Past Week session. Mm-hmm. This is the section where we're supposed to be advocating for masters rowing, but let's just talk rowing. Hell, it's the Olympics. It only happens once every 4 years, roughly. I found the commentators to be really, really interesting. So I know a couple of the guys who are doing the on-course commentary, and sometimes you can hear them in the background. Mm-hmm. But the channel I've been watching has had Martin Cross on as the pundit, as the expert. And it's very refreshing that he is prepared to make an opinion, but he's also very straight about correcting himself if he's not right. And there was a lovely incident when he talked about the Sinkovich brothers winning an Olympic gold in two disciplines, in the sculling and the sweep, in the double and the pair. And he said, this is the first time. And someone corrected him on Twitter because I saw what they'd written, and they said, no, it was Marnie McBean and Kathleen Heddle who did it in the 90s. Mm-hmm. And he was just so straight up and said, I was wrong. But the thing the Sinkoviches have done is they've also won the European gold medal. So fair dues, they have, achieved something unique. But, that sort of honesty and the fact that he is so professional, he's commentating live at the Olympics. He's also monitoring his own Twitter stream. Wow.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's just definitely a lot. And there's so many facts, and the commentators are trying. One, they want to make things interesting, and they want to help the rowing population know more about the history of the people and their background, and to be able to like draw some of these facts up. I've listened to Adam Creek a bit, who went from his Row Tokyo podcast to he's done some of the commentating for Canada, and I've taken my masters, and many of them are relatively new scullers, and we've really been in our classes, we've been discussing what they're observing and how it's connected to what they're learning, and they're like, oh yeah, you really do tell us to do that. Oh yeah, they really do keep their arms really long, or they really do, So I mean, it's been really fun to have people who are relatively new to rowing, I mean, a year or two or three, and have them start to observe and compare to what they're learning and how they're translating that into the boat, and they're making an adjustment. So it's been really cool to see actually people row much better by the end of the Olympics from when it started, because they see all different images and they're paying attention to things. So
yeah, good stuff, everybody. Now, if you're listening live, you can put comments under the live feed stream. We'd really appreciate it if you would share the feed right now, so that a few other people know that we're live and they might choose to come join us. A month ago, sorry, more than that, 2 months ago, we did a listener survey, and those of you who are on our newsletter list will have received a link to fill in the survey. And I'm pleased today to be able to give you just a little bit of the feedback. There was an awful lot of nice things people said about us, which I'm not going to repeat here. But what I am going to do is to run through some of the suggestions that were made when we asked the question, what's one thing that we could do better? Here are a few things that Marlene and I have been discussing and that we're going to try and see what we can do. Firstly, the timing of these live episodes. If you want to watch live, it's really user unfriendly if you're in Europe. And so we're going to see what we can do once a month to schedule our podcast at a much earlier time so that people in Europe can listen and watch during their evening. Secondly, we were reminded that we often focus on sculling when we're giving our answers to questions, and that we should also consider our listeners who are sweep rowers and those who have an ergo or indoor rowing focus. So thank you for reminding us of that. And we are going to try and balance what we say into the 3 different disciplines. Someone else said they would like to hear less from our live viewers because it interrupts the flow, and we do accept that. So what we're going to do is when people make a comment, we're going to put it up on screen. So if you're watching, you can see it. But if you're listening to the audio, it doesn't disrupt. Having said that, sometimes our live viewers say some awesome things, so we do actually want to discuss them as well. So we're going to try and strike a balance there. We were also asked if we could have special guests and experts on. And I think that's a great idea. And so Marlene and I are working on seeing what we can achieve. And if you have someone who you think would be a great expert or special guest, please shoot their name our way and we'll see if we can invite them on. We were asked if we could differentiate our advice, because this listener thought that people in their 30s and 40s are training to punish their bodies, to row hard, and that this is different from people who are in their mid-50s, because she thought that they were rowing to avoid injury. And so Marlene and I have a slight difference of opinion there, but we'll take that into consideration. Lastly, we will do news and event schedules, and we're not going to do that. We feel that this is very adequately covered in places like Row 2K, in places like domestic rowing websites around Europe. So places like David Biddulph's rowing website for the UK has an event schedule of every single regatta in the country. So that's not something we want to focus on, but we are happy to mention events in the Facebook page and possibly in our newsletter. So get in touch with us and let's see if that's something that could be appropriate for the future. Now, let's move on to our next topic, which is the biggie for this week: troubleshooting steering. So topical. We had a few steering in the Olympic regatta. That
we sure did.
Steering something that affects us all, whether we're in a boat that does have steering wires or does not. We do need to be able to row in a straight line, otherwise it's hugely frustrating. So Marlene, let's kick off with some of the real basics about steering. How do you observe what's going wrong before you can, before you can start to fix something? You need to try and make a diagnosis. What is happening? And then possibly why is that happening? And then what can I do about it? So kick us off.
Well, when you're rowing or sculling, obviously you have to know where you're going, and it's going to depend on what kind of water you're rowing on. Are you on a lake? Are you on a river that has bends? You have to know your traffic pattern. Staying in your traffic pattern wherever you row is incredibly important. And if you are finding that you cannot point, I often teach people to, if they're in a straight boat, to point off of a stern point and know where they're going. And then if they're going around a turn, pick another point and steer off it. So looking at your stern and looking at the trail of the water or your wake will, one, give you an idea if you're going straight. If you're noticing that you're constantly veering to one side or the other, you have to determine, one, is it you? Are you like putting one oar in before the other one? Is one oar getting one side of the boat getting caught, the other side going in? If you don't have equal timing, you might not, your boat isn't going to go straight. Did you bend your fin? If you hit your fin on something and you're just saying, oh my gosh, this boat is always going to port. Well, check your equipment, check your span, check your fin. And the way you can check if it's the fin is take a few strokes with good pressure and then let it run and let the boat glide and see if the boat glides straight. If the boat curves when you're gliding and the oars are out of the water, there's a good chance that it could be your fin. So you might have to go there and look at that and try to figure out if it's your fin or if it's rigging. But in a small boat, it takes a long time to learn how to steer straight. It takes a long time to learn how to steer consistently. So at first you have to make little, try to steer off of a point that you're looking at and try to make little changes before you go way off course.
Yeah, I'm going to correct what you've just said. It takes a long time to learn how to row or scull straight. Steering for me is the act of changing direction, not of going straight. So it does. I mean, back to when I was first in a single and Marlow Rowing Club, I decided to do an early morning outing, and it was in the dark, and I put lights on my single and I went out, and I was not skilled enough to row in a straight line. And I kept going into the bank, and then I kept going too far into the middle of the river. And it made me realize that I do not have enough skill to do a nighttime outing. I'm going to have to go and answer that door. You're on your own, okay. Marlene. On to the next topic.
But so when you're steering, I mean, obviously, or trying to go straight, I mean, learning how to go straight is definitely a skill and something to practice from pointing off the shore. Maybe learn how to vary pressure with one leg or the other leg. If you're in a small boat, if you don't have a rudder, you can vary the length of your arc on one side or the other side and see how the boat reacts. So just learning how to turn in a small boat or in a single, you can make subtle corrections by pushing harder with one leg and really easing off on the other leg, but you're not going to be able to make a sharp correction that way. You can do it by rowing a little bit longer at the catch on one side And in some head races, people go from catch just to mid drive, and they go back up to the catch because they don't want weight in the bow if they're having to make a big sharp turn. Other people pull it all the way around. So it depends on a little bit where you are and what you're trying to do. But if you're constantly going to one direction versus being, like Rebecca said, 1 minute into the bank, the next minute into, these are all inconsistencies, perhaps in pressure, perhaps in timing from one side of the boat to the other, the amount of time the oar's in the water, the depth of are you leaning to one side? All these kinds of things of being centered and even and symmetrical definitely affect your ability to go straight.
Yeah, I personally, when I'm steering, I don't reach more at the catch. I do it on timing. I try and put the blade in earlier. If it's a very steep turn, I totally agree with you that, you do need to have good length and reach and have quite an aggressive placement and push. But yeah, it's a subtlety. So fundamentally, your steering, your ability to row in a straight line will be vastly improved if you can improve your own blade work and your consistency. However, working out what has gone wrong is your first step. Your second step is then knowing how to correct it. So in the moment, you can only correct your steering based on what is actually happening. So you need to do what Marlene just described, which is to take small adjustments. And remember that at the catch, you have much more leverage. Your spoon of your blade is very nearly parallel with the side of the boat. So it's at a very acute angle. And so a very small amount of additional pressure actually brings the bows round quite quickly. So one thing you could do just in practice or do it in a warm-up is scull at a steady pace at a reasonably low rate, say 18 or 20, and then one stroke, take extra pressure on one oar, and the next stroke, do it on the other. Just see if you can shift your boat quietly from one side to the other. If you've got the room, you could do it for 2 strokes and then go back to rowing symmetrically, knowing that you've changed course, and then 5 strokes later, 2 strokes the other way, and then go straight. And that's the sort of thing that you can just use just to practice your skill at bringing that bow around a tiny little bit. And that works in a double, it works in a single, it works in a pair, and it can also work in crew boats. Even if you have a rudder wire, all 4 or 8 of you can practice it. Harder for an 8 to do, but it can be done. And it's well worth having that skill kind of in your toolbox of skills because you might need it.
Sure. And I think it's a good point. Like some of the techniques that I described are not necessarily always techniques that I personally use, but they're things that other people might recommend in head racing. There's lots of ways to turn a boat. And certainly the more subtle you can be with it, the better, because you don't want to be turning your boat and pushing your bow against a whole bunch of water. That's not going to be very effective. If you can do it with timing, if you can do it with subtle changes with leg pressure, if you can do it with little subtle things that don't cause the boat to push against the stream or kind of that allows the boat to bank a little bit, your boat's going to travel a little smoother. Steering with a crew boat with a tow is, quite an exciting, it's quite a skill. It's quite a skill when you've got a fast moving boat and being able to make subtle changes, like not cranking on the rudder when the oars are out of the water and the whole boat all of a sudden suddenly flies to one side. But this is definitely one of Rebecca's great talents. I think I have much less experience doing it because I simply don't have the opportunity to row in quads very often anymore. So I just haven't done it in a very, very long time. So
on that basis, if you are in a crew boat and you're steering with a steering wire, in the same way that Marlene talked about the basic checks that you can do with your single, pair or double, here are the basic checks you can do for a steered boat. Number one, check that your rudder wire, your rudder is set straight. You need to do this either on the dock at the pontoon or on trestles. You need to get one person to put their hands over the fin and rudder, because most fins and rudders are a single integral unit nowadays. And by doing that, they can pinch the two together and hold the rudder straight in line with the fin. So the rudder is the bit that moves, the fin is the bit that's stationary. Then the person who's steering needs to stand or sit in their seat, and they can adjust the shoe. So generally there's a wing nut that points, that attaches your shoe to the rudder wire, and it's usually between two fixed points. You pick where you want it, whether you want it plumb center, slightly off because your feet naturally sit to one side or the other, but you set it to be straight with someone else holding the rudder wire, the actual rudder and fin. Do not trust on the T-bar, which is often above the deck of the stern of the boat. Because remember, this is just a bit of metal that is slotted onto the actual rudder post. And that could be, you know, there's margin for error there. So just because that's at 90 degrees and square off doesn't mean that below the water, it's also set true. The second thing to check is that your rudder wires have a little tension in them. If they're very, very slack, it makes the steering incredibly soggy and really, really hard to make accurate adjustments. One way around this is use bicycle brake cable tubing. You probably know what they look. It's usually black, and your brake cable runs through it. If you have those, you can then enable the cable to have enough tension in it as it comes off the mounting down the side of the boat and into where your shoe is, so that whether you move the foot stretcher forward or back, you can still have good tension on the rudder wires. If you don't know what I mean, come and ask me. The third thing with troubleshooting steering is that you must have a shoe that fits you. If your foot is waggling around inside a shoe that's over large, how can you be expected to know whether or not you've actually turned the shoe? Because you might just be turning your foot inside the shoe. So those are just really simple things that you can do just to kick off. And just as a tiny little sales pitch, this coming month, August, in our individual, crew and club coach programs on the paid Faster Masters site is a detailed article all about steering. And if you want to learn how to tow steer, really worthwhile buying this month's episodes. Now, we got a few, when we said we were going to focus on steering, we also got, a couple of questions in from folks who were on our email list. The first one I'm going to read out is from Chris Croupiers, who says, and I quote, "I had a steering problem last weekend. It was the first time I did a stake boat race, and there was a tiny bit of crosswind. I had a hard time keeping the boat straight while it was being held and ended up hitting the lane buoys after the first few strokes. I couldn't figure out how to make my adjustments subtle enough such that I didn't either yank the boat out of the stake boat person's hands or drive it towards them." So let's talk about stake boat starts. Chris, you would not have yanked it out of their hands by making adjustments while you're stationary waiting for the start. Definitely not. The whole point about the stake boat person is if they're experienced, they will be holding your stern. And you're only making really small movements with your blade to bring the bows around. So one way to make that movement light and effective is slide your hand down the handle. So you're actually holding the shaft of the blade, not the handle, and roll forwards to at least half slide, further if you're confident, and then reach out the side of the boat to make those little movements. In that way, your angle of attack of the blade is even sharper than usual, and it kind of acts like a side thruster on a ferry or whatever. It pushes the bow sideways, so you would not have yanked it out of their hands. Secondly, with a crosswind, you've got to expect the crosswind to push your boat. It's great that you recognized it was there, and you then have a bit of a guess/judgment call. You know, in the approach to the moment when they say go, or the whistle or the gun or the traffic light goes, you know there are several things that precede that. So, for example, they will do a call over, usually, unless there's a quick start in progress. And I'm basing this on rules of racing in countries where I've lived. So Marlene will correct me for North America. They call over and they call the name of each crew, lane 1 through to however many there are. That definitely precedes them saying attention and go. So while the call over is going, you can be still pushing your bows around. You will not miss the start. And in a crosswind, you want your bow to be pointed a little bit over into the wind, so that when they have finished the call over, and the next step is usually them saying, you know, attention or come forward, your bows are not straight, they are pointed into the wind, so that as you're waiting for them to give the go, the bows slowly drift back, and hopefully they will be plumb straight when they call the go. Doesn't always happen, and you're absolutely right. Having to do a couple of little corrective strokes in the first couple of strokes of your start is a fact of rowing life.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry you hit the buoys this time, but do know that you actually can work quite hard against the stake boat holder, far more than you actually think. So you might want to practice that. You can find someone who can just hold your stern for you in your normal practice. I know that you row, I think, on the ocean, so maybe someone will wade out into the nice warm water and hold it for you. But practice that, and then know how hard you can correct the boat without pulling out of their hands.
It's another good reason. Chris mentioned if you're going to steer into the buoys, this is another really good reason to make sure that when you release that you're feathering high and you're getting your blade high enough off the water, because in case you go into the buoys or near the buoys, you want to make sure that you're going to go above the buoys and not hit the buoys. So yeah, that is one reason to practice your release and feathering high as your hands come away, and maybe even exaggerate that a tiny bit off the start, depending on what the conditions are, you know, especially if it's a little bit choppy or you've got buoys, and the size of the buoys can vary depending on where you're rowing. At Canadian Henley years ago, the buoys used to be the size of soccer balls. So if you hit one, it was going to knock the oar. I mean, you're going over, or it's going to knock the oar out of your hand. They used to be so big. So you have to plan for that, but, be able to feather high in case you're in that situation.
Yeah. Adrian Ellison is one of our regular listeners, and he is an expert coxswain, and he says a few topics to consider. Steering and crosswinds. Do you have any, we talked about that. Do you have any experience of or opinions about employing a canard fin under the bow seat of a crew boat? So this is basically where you actually have a skeg in the stern and steering in the stern, and also steering in the bow. And then thirdly, he also asks about Carl Douglas's aero fin, which is an integral fin and rudder all in one, compared with separate skeg rudder combinations. And also he said the latest international level carbon fiber integrated fin rudders, where the rudder's now absolutely tiny. I think it was mentioned by James Cracknell in some of his Olympic commentary that the rudder is the size of a credit card. So, Marlene, do you have any views on this? I have a couple, but
honestly, I don't know a ton about it, as I said, because I don't steer team boats a whole lot. So you probably have more experience with it than I do.
My view about the integral rudder and fin all in one, I think generally this is a good thing for one simple reason, which is that when you have two elements, and in this case, a fin or skeg and a separate rudder, the potential for them not to be correctly aligned is high, particularly if they're made of aluminium. These can bend. You've probably all had experience of knocking the fin when you take the boat out of the water. And you also know that you can bend them back straight. So that's one thing. So the carbon fiber ones are obviously a bit more robust, as in they're not likely to bend, they'll break rather than bend. And so my instinct is that an all-in-one fin rudder combo probably gives less margin for error and probably more accuracy, but I haven't tested it. So that's just a guess. I don't know a lot about, I mean, Carl Douglas Aerofin, yes, that is exactly what you've just described. He also has, I know that quite a lot of boat manufacturers offer a deeper and a shallower fin, because on a straight line course, you want a deeper fin to make the boat go straight. If you're doing head racing and you need to do lots of turns, that deep fin is going to make the effort you have to put in order to turn much greater, whether that effort is coming from steering wires or from crews using pressure to steer. So I hope that answers your question, Adrian. I'm sure you've got some ideas, and perhaps you should be one of the experts that we get on the show to talk about this.
And if I remember correctly, in Carlos Zeza's book about head racing, he's got a whole section about fins for head racing in there, and cutting down fins and different fin designs to help you in head racing, particularly when you're on a very turny course like the Head of the Charles.
I will put a link to that in our newsletter. So if people are listening and you're not on our newsletter list, sign up fast, and I'll put a link into Carlos's book, because it is the book about rowing, racing, head racing.
And especially the Head of the Charles. Definitely.
Now, Marlene, you had another question from Irene in Berlin.
Berlin, yes. So here's what, this is from Irene Rudert, and she writes, in our club, we aim to train everybody in steering boats and offer an annual course in steering with 2 days of theory plus a theoretical and practical exam. I thought this was very cool. We then award these people the status of foreman or forewoman, and each boat in our club needs at least one foreman or forewoman in it. Nonetheless, very few rowers, even with this foreperson status, volunteer to steer! ! Some shy away from the responsibilities. Some say they can't concentrate on their rowing if they have to steer and turn around. And others claim they can't turn around well enough due to lack of flexibility, injury, and old age. How can we solve this? I hope you can give me and our club some ideas, especially for those who claim to be physically incapable of turning. We encourage rowers to steer at least part of a session and then swap places in the boat. For example, to minimize the duration of suffering and share the load. I like that. Some clubs fix mirrors to the outriggers, but that just looks so uncool and doesn't solve the problem of turning around completely anyway. I'll listen to your recording of the podcast and wish you a lovely time. Well, you know, I mean, my first thought is I think it's very cool that they take the time to educate people this way. I mean, quite honestly, it's the first club that I know of that does something this comprehensive for steering. So obviously the club puts an emphasis on it and shows that it's important. And people take the course. So if you're taking the course, why are you taking the course if you're not interested in doing it? So, I mean, that's sort of one thing there. If you need to learn something, I guess one of my questions would be, if somebody has, you know, what would bridge the gap between them taking the course and some of the discomfort that they experience why they don't want to do it? So maybe there's something, maybe they need a little bit more practice. Maybe they need to learn better how to row and integrate that, you know what I'm saying? So, I mean, if there's a discrepancy between taking the course and then practice, maybe there needs to be an intermediary step in there to help people actually get more comfortable in a practical sense before they go in a boat with full speed, for example.
Yeah,
what would you think?
Yeah, I totally support that. I take my hat off to Irene and her club.
Yeah.
Brilliant. One thing I would say is that it is possible to divide up the jobs. One person steer and another person look around. So if you have the steering seat in something other than the bow seat is the only person who can really look around with great confidence. Particularly, you don't want to have to look over the head of someone in front of you. But having the steersman at stroke and the looker at bow, and then we can also divide the job even further and have someone else who's doing the calls for the outing. And our fallback position is that the bow person only calls when it is a steering matter. So, for example, when we know we're coming to the turnaround point, everybody knows that the bow person is going to be the one who's going to call for when we're going to stop rowing. It's not the job of the caller to do that. So they don't look around. There's only one person looking around, because of course that unbalances the boat somewhat as well. And however skilled you are, I used to try, when I was in a double with a very experienced rower, I used to try and look around without her noticing, and it was really hard.
Yeah, it doesn't work. Right.
She knew. So I think that, Irene, definitely divide up the jobs. Secondly, do your best to set up practices after people have learned that are deliberately structured to build confidence. So, for example, your new steers person could be doing the steering during the warm-up, where you have half the crew rowing, and you start off with the steers person not in the half that's rowing, so that they can look around and load while half the crew's doing their warm-up. And then when you switch over and they are rowing and steering, then you can have someone who is in the non-rowing group be giving them instructions. So all they have to do is move their foot. They don't have to look around, and you can say, however you call it, I have a call which is about the direction first. So whether it's towards bow side or towards stroke side. And secondly, then I have the degree of angle. So I will say gently or hard or really hard.
Yeah.
The key then is the boat's going slowly because only half the crew's rowing. Someone else is looking out and taking care of safety from that point of view. And all you have to do is move your foot. And when you move your foot, look down the stern of the boat, or if you're steering from the bow seat, look straight over the heads of the people in front of you to a point on the bank, like Marlene said earlier. Get your point. And as you've moved your foot, then leave it in that position and watch the horizon slowly move past your point, so that you know that the boat is turning. By keeping your head still and your gaze in a single direction, that really helps you to see how rapidly the boat is turning. And then the last thing to remember is straighten your foot up when the turn is completed, so that your feet are again parallel, and keep your heel down, because that really helps. At the end of the stroke, some people lift their heels off the foot stretcher, and I'm not going to criticize that in any way, but when you're learning to steer, leaving your heel down helps you to focus on whether or not you've actually got your foot straight or whether it's slightly shifted.
Do you think, Rebecca, for somebody who's steering, if they're in a situation where they have to steer and they do have to look around also, to find a rhythm in their stroke cycle where they have that little look around, so that they're trying to build that some consistency in their stroke cycle?
I think that's a really good point. Personally, I always look around after the finish. So when the blades are out of the water and I know I've got the whole of the recovery to make my look around. So you know what the rhythm of whatever racing you're doing is. So you can know in your mind how much time you've got. And on the recovery, so as long as I get my arms out straight, I do not need to worry about anything else except possibly squaring. If I square late, I square late. And so I feel that gives me the maximum amount of time to look around. So that's my personal preference. I also have a terrible habit of rushing the slide when I'm looking around, because I always think I'm going to be late because I'm looking around. And I'm still trying to break that one.
But I think that's important. Just build it into your stroke. Some people look on the drive. Some people look at the crossover on the drive. Some people look at the crossover on the recovery. I think it's a question of what works for you and what's consistent, so that you can practice it and know when you're going to do it, and you build it into the rhythm.
Yeah, I think agreeing as a crew before you go on the water that this is a practice outing, and one of the key things we're practicing is steering, is really helpful, because, you know, my view of even a bendy river is, I think of it not as a bendy river, but I think of it as a straight followed by a turn, followed by a straight, followed by a turn. So that even if those straights are only 5 strokes long, I'm deliberately steering, straightening up, steering, straightening up, steering the other way, straightening up. So that you think of it, you know, as a little sort of graph with straight lines, and then a tiny curve, and then a straight line.
Yes, and it brings you back to 0. And I think that's important. Like, even if it's a 5-stroke straightaway, you're getting back to 0. You're getting back to your reference point, because if you don't make that correction, you could end up with way too much degrees one way or the other way.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And oversteering, which is what happened in the men's 4 Olympic final, is a real challenge for beginners. Steering is much more subtle than most people think. And I'm sure Adrian will know this from novice coxswains. They have a tendency to lam the rudder right one way and then right the other way. And then you don't find your midpoint. So one of the things about looking at the horizon and seeing how the boat is turning gives you a sense of how many strokes it takes to make this particular turn. And obviously some turns are steeper than others. And in fact, in our club, we have a very well-loved boat that is called the 3-stroke lag, because whenever you're steering it, it takes 3 strokes before you turn the foot, and you're looking straight, and it just begins to turn on that 3rd stroke. But I do think that's also, in that boat, a function of the fact that it doesn't have rudder wires. It has a nylon cable. And I think those have a little bit of tension, stretchiness, and that absorbs some of the turning moment for a while before it actually turns. Having said that, the boat does really tight corners. So it's actually a really great boat. But you have to kind of anticipate it. One thing I will also mention is that the turning point of the boat is in the middle of the boat. So it's not necessarily where you're sitting. So if you're at stroke, the turning is going to turn around the midpoint of the boat, which might be behind you. So when it comes to an obstacle, if you're sitting easy and steering, you know, for the pair who's doing a warm up, say you're going to turn around a buoy, find the buoy, start your turn before you get to the buoy, because if you wait until you're level with it, you will overshoot before you make the turn. So you need to understand the turning arc of that particular boat and how far in advance of the, you know, the turning marker that you need to make your move. There's a lot to this.
There is definitely, and a lot of practice time. And I think, just like you said, having, for Irene's club, having specific outing, like this is a steering practice, and, you know, maybe that will bridge that gap for people and get them more confident.
Yeah. If you can do 2 boats side by side, that's also a really, really good steering practice. You know, even if your beginner steersman is sitting easy and you just have a couple, the rest of the crew rowing, it really builds confidence that they can sit parallel with another crew. And you do learn, you know, there's no
absolutely. And just knowing someone's off your end. I like having, in singles groups, I have them do Indian sprints. So I have them row single file, and then one boat has to pull out and row fast. You know, the other groups, they're rowing relatively slowly, but they have to pull out, sprint up to the front, get into the lead line, be the lead boat, and they practice. So they have to practice gauging their speed, keeping distance between each other, pulling out, passing. So, you know, in a small boat like a single, that's one way to start to work on your skills if you're planning to do some head racing.
Yeah, leapfrogging. Excellent. Right, feathering with wet handles. This is a conundrum, and we often get asked about it. It's horrid. Rowing with wet handles.
It is hard. I used to
It's just-
cheat, though. I used to cheat.
Oh, tell me.
I used to put my pogies on and just keep my handles dry.
Well, that's great. I mean, that's a great solution. I hadn't even thought of that.
I just avoided it. So I would even
Usually-
race. I would even race like that sometimes when it was like, if it was a real downpour, because I was like, well, at least it's not going to fly out of my, it might fly out of my hand, but it's not going to fly out of my pogie. So
I often find that even if it is a real downpour, there's often a bit of your shirt that is dry, particularly usually in the middle of your chest or maybe tucked into your shorts, that actually you can dry your handles, and that gives you a little bit of confidence. So go on, Marlene, what's your top tip? Feathering.
well, I think that the top thing is not over gripping, not too much, and keeping weight over your hands, keeping weight over the handles, and making sure that you can feel the weight of the oar in your hand, and trying to make as subtle motions as you can, because I think the harder, the more if it's raining and you're a little bit nervous, you might tend to over grip the handle, and I think that is actually going to make it worse. So, remember, we've talked about our open palm drill or open fingers drill. That's a really good thing to practice, to be able to manage to move with your oar handle without having to over handle it. So that's one thing, that I would practice. Might depend also, you might want to experiment with your grips, because different textured material or different material of grips, depending on the type of oars that you use, might behave better or worse, be more slippery or less slippery in rainy conditions. So that's another thing. If you're finding your oar handles are extremely slippery, you might want to look at a different grip material, or something that might not be as slippery as what you have. I think there are some choices out there.
Certainly, if you have a oar handle that has been much used and a lot of hand sweat has gone into it, when it rains and it gets wet, it can get really foamy. Like you can get this white, creamy kind of glue.
Yeah, yucky, right.
It is just that you have not cleaned your handles. So, light detergent, hot water, clean them. I entirely agree. The only solution to feeling that you are in control of your handle, the whole point about what people dislike about wet handles is you feel like you're not in control. The only solution is to have a light, loose grip, and to remember when the oars are out of the water, if you have feathered high above the waves, then you do not need to be holding the handles on the recovery. You can row with flat palms and pushing your handles down with your palms to keep the blades high. So understand that on the recovery, at least, you do not need to grip. For me, the bit that hurts the most is this muscle in here between my thumb and my forefinger. It gets really tight. And if that gets too tight and I overgrip, then your forearm can seize up. If you feel that starting to happen, my solution is on the recovery is to, I call it playing the piano on the handle. So wiggle your fingers, even if it's just a couple of times as you come up the recovery. Make sure you keep downward pressure on the handles so the blades are high above the water and you're not going to clip the water. But if the more you can release the grip on the recovery, the better you will manage the wet handle situation.
Definitely. And I like your tip. Absolutely. Clean your handles regularly, because that does definitely make a difference to not get them too slippery. So,
yeah. I also have always found that in sweep, the wooden handles for me stay drier than any of the modern composite materials. Even if the wood is, a veneer wrap, it's not even like a solid wooden handle. And I have to say that I think that this is possibly because wood absorbs water a little bit.
Sure. Oh yeah, absolutely.
I've definitely done head races where after the race, my handle is sopping wet in the middle, but it's gotten dry under where my hands are holding the oar. So I think that's worth it.
Yeah. Well, years ago, rowing with a wooden sweep handle, I used to wet my handle, and actually wet it, and I felt like I had a little bit more grip with it. And that may very well be because, some of the fibers dilate. So, they're going to be a little bit cushion, almost a little bit cushiony there. But, I used to splash water on my handles. I saw somebody doing that at the start of the Olympics too. He had a wooden oar handle, and he was wetting his oar handle. So
I've seen the Kiwi pair. I think it was Hamish Bond at pace during a race, reach his inside hand into the water and splash water onto his oar handle.
Really?
Oh, I'm not sure I'd do that during a race in a pair. But
wow, that's what you see. So, but I think with the natural fibers, it does. I mean, that's how they build wooden boats, right? They dilate. They varnish one side, heat gun, sponge water, and dilate the fibers, and whoop, shape the hull. So
there you go. That's how you do it.
That's how you do it.
Well, I think we've covered off a ton in this week's episode. Just a quick reminder that if you're not on our newsletter list, go to fastermastersrowing.com/newsletter, and you get a weekly summary of what we're talking about here on the podcast. Particularly if you can't listen live, please tell your friends and share this podcast. It's available on all of the podcast apps. Just search for Faster Masters Rowing Radio. Till this time next week, it's been great having you, but I have to go watch some more Olympic rowing now.
Yes, me too. 8s and singles today.
It's going to be great.
It's going to be incredible. It's going to be incredible.
Till next time. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.